April 18, 1942. USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Tokyo. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle watched as deck crews positioned his B-25 Mitchell bomber on the carrier's pitching deck. The weather forecast predicted worsening conditions. Intelligence confirmed Japanese picket boats patrolled these waters. What none of them knew was that this desperate gamble, launching Army bombers from a Navy carrier for a one-way mission, would shatter Japan's sense of invulnerability and trigger a strategic miscalculation that would cost them the war in the Pacific. Japan owned the psychological initiative. Since Pearl Harbor 4 months earlier, Imperial forces had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The Philippines fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies capitulated. Japanese carriers had raided Ceylon, threatening the Indian Ocean. American forces had suffered defeat after defeat. Public morale in the United States plummeted as news of each catastrophe arrived. The Japanese High Command believed American resolve would collapse under sustained pressure. Admiral Yamamoto's strategy was straightforward: deliver crushing blows, expand the defensive perimeter, force a negotiated peace before American industrial capacity could be mobilized. The home islands remained untouched, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the combined fleet. No enemy bomber had ever reached Japan. The concept of invulnerability shaped Japanese strategic thinking. President Franklin Roosevelt demanded action, not for military gain. American planners knew a single raid would cause minimal damage, but for psychological impact. The American people needed proof that their forces could strike back. Japan needed to understand that distance provided no immunity. Captain Francis Lowe, a submariner on Admiral Ernest King's staff, conceived the basic concept while observing Army bombers conducting training at Norfolk Naval Station. What if Army bombers could launch from a carrier? The idea seemed impossible. Heavy bombers had never operated from carriers. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber represented the theoretical minimum. Length 62 feet, wingspan 67 feet, weight 15 tons when loaded. Maximum carrier deck length was 800 feet, but only 467 feet was available for takeoff after spotting all aircraft. The Mitchell required at least 1,200 feet for conventional takeoff. Lieutenant Henry Miller, a Navy test pilot, conducted secret trials at Norfolk in early February 1942. He positioned a B-25 on a simulated carrier deck marked on the runway. With full power, flaps at 15 degrees, and a stiff headwind, Miller managed takeoff in 450 feet. The numbers worked theoretically, but only with a carrier steaming full speed into strong wind, creating relative wind velocity of 40 knots across the deck. There would be no margin for error. A single miscalculation meant certain death. The Army Air Forces needed a volunteer commander. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was 45 years old, ancient by combat pilot standards. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had set world speed records in the 1920s. He had developed instrument flying techniques that revolutionized aviation. He was a test pilot who understood risk calculations better than anyone in the Army Air Forces. General Henry Arnold personally selected Doolittle, knowing the mission would require technical brilliance and absolute determination. 24 B-25 Mitchell bombers assembled at Eglin Field, Florida, in March 1942. Doolittle selected volunteer crews without revealing the mission details. Each crew underwent intensive short-field takeoff training. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller taught Army pilots carrier procedures they had never imagined performing. The bombers were stripped of unnecessary equipment. Lower gun turrets removed, saving 800 pounds. Liaison radios removed, saving another 200 pounds. Rubber self-sealing fuel bladders installed in every available space, increasing range to 2,400 miles. Each bomber would carry 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive, and 1 incendiary cluster. Calculations revealed the critical problem. The bombers could reach Japan from a carrier, but they could never return. Maximum range barely reached the Chinese coast. The plan required launching 600 miles from Japan, bombing assigned targets, flying 1,300 miles to friendly airfields in China, where nationalist forces controlled coastal provinces. The crews would abandon their aircraft and make their way to safety through Japanese-occupied territory. Success depended on factors beyond their control: weather, navigation accuracy, Chinese cooperation, and luck. USS Hornet departed San Francisco on April 2, 1942. 16 B-25 bombers, the maximum number the carrier could accommodate, were lashed to the flight deck. The crew had been told only that they were headed toward Pearl Harbor. Not until April 10th, when Hornet rendezvoused with Task Force 16, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, aboard USS Enterprise, did most personnel learn the truth. Halsey's message to his fleet was characteristically direct. This force is bound for Tokyo. The task force consisted of 2 carriers, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers. Enterprise would provide fighter protection. Hornet's deck, crowded with Army bombers, prevented her from launching defensive aircraft. The formation would approach within 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers, then withdraw at maximum speed. Naval doctrine considered this insanely risky. Japanese patrol planes and picket boats covered approaches to the home islands. If discovered, the carriers would face the combined fleet with no chance of survival. April 18, 1942, 0600 hours. The radar operator on Enterprise detected a surface contact 42 miles ahead. Cruiser USS Nashville moved to investigate and found Japanese patrol boat Nito Maru. The Nashville opened fire, sinking the picket boat, but not before it transmitted a warning. 3 enemy carriers sighted our position. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible decision. Japanese forces would converge on their position within hours. The task force was still 650 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles beyond the planned launch point. Launching now meant the bombers would run out of fuel before reaching Chinese airfields. Not launching meant abandoning the mission and retreating while Japanese forces hunted them. Halsey made the only choice that aligned with his aggressive instincts. He ordered immediate launch. All 16 bombers would take off 8 hours ahead of schedule, knowing they could not reach their planned destinations. Doolittle's bomber, loaded to maximum weight, positioned at the carrier's stern. Hornet increased speed to 25 knots, turning into a 25-knot wind, creating 50 knots of relative wind across the deck. The deck rose and fell in heavy seas. Timing would be critical. At 0820 hours, the deck launch officer, kneeling at the deck edge, where Doolittle could see him clearly, watched the bow rising and falling. As the bow began to rise, he swung his flag in a circular motion. Doolittle released brakes and pushed throttles to maximum power. The Mitchell accelerated down the pitching deck, engines roaring at full power. 467 feet of deck, then nothing but ocean. The bomber's wheels left the deck as the bow dropped away beneath him. For a terrifying moment, the B-25 mushed toward the waves. Then airspeed built, lift increased, and Doolittle climbed away. Behind him, 15 more bombers followed at intervals, each pilot watching the deck officer's flag, each facing the same moment of truth, where deck ended and survival depended on speed and lift. Lieutenant Travis Hoover in Aircraft Number 2 launched without incident. Lieutenant Robert Gray, piloting Aircraft Number 3, felt his bomber settle toward the water after leaving the deck before clawing back into the air. By 0920 hours, all 16 bombers were airborne, formed loosely, heading toward Japan at 200 feet altitude. The Navy task force reversed course and raced away at maximum speed. Army crews were on their own. The flight toward Japan took 4 hours. Doolittle, navigated by dead reckoning, maintaining altitude below 500 feet to avoid detection. At 1300 hours, land appeared ahead. The Japanese coast, exactly where calculations predicted. The surprise was absolute. No fighters rose to intercept. No anti-aircraft fire greeted them. 4 months of unbroken victory had convinced Japanese defenders that the home islands were inviolable. Doolittle's target was Tokyo. He climbed to 1,200 feet, identified his aim points, and released his bombs at 1330 hours. 3 high-explosive bombs and 1 incendiary cluster fell across industrial facilities in northern Tokyo. Bomb bay doors closed. Doolittle dropped back to rooftop level and raced toward the coast at maximum speed. Behind him, smoke rose from impact points. 15 other bombers struck targets across Japan. Tokyo received the heaviest attack with 10 aircraft bombing various districts. Lieutenant Ted Lawson bombed steel mills and oil refineries in southern Tokyo. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark struck railroad yards and factories in the industrial district. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy bombed naval installations at Yokosuka. 3 bombers attacked Nagoya, targeting aircraft factories and port facilities. 1 bomber struck Osaka. Another bombed Kobe. The attacks lasted 30 minutes. By 1400 hours, all bombers had cleared Japanese airspace, racing toward China at wave-top altitude. Japanese forces reacted with confusion and rage. Air raid sirens wailed across cities that had never experienced attack. Citizens who had been assured of absolute protection watched American bombers flying overhead with impunity. Fighter squadrons scrambled but found no targets. The bombers had vanished before effective response could be organized. The physical damage was minimal. 50 buildings destroyed, 90 damaged, approximately 50 civilians killed, 400 wounded, 250 casualties among military and industrial workers. In military terms, the raid achieved nothing significant. The psychological impact was catastrophic for Japanese strategic assumptions. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, the emperor himself was vulnerable. The myth of invulnerability shattered in 30 minutes. Radio Tokyo announced that several enemy planes had penetrated Japanese airspace and caused minor damage, attempting to minimize the humiliation. But the Japanese leadership understood the implications immediately. Admiral Yamamoto recognized the raid as proof that Japan's defensive perimeter was inadequate. He had argued for months that the combined fleet needed to eliminate America's carrier force before it could threaten the home islands. The Doolittle Raid proved his argument with devastating clarity. Yamamoto accelerated plans for Operation Midway, the operation to seize Midway Island and draw out the American carriers for decisive battle. The target date moved from July to early June. Intelligence preparations were compressed, training schedules accelerated. This urgency, triggered directly by the Doolittle Raid, introduced critical vulnerabilities into Japanese planning. Hasty preparation meant incomplete intelligence. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew Yamamoto's plan, knew the target, knew the timing. At Midway on June 4, 1942, less than 7 weeks after the Doolittle Raid, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers, with aircraft being refueled on their decks. In 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning wrecks. Later that day, Kairyu joined them. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, the elite of their naval aviation, and with them, the strategic initiative they would never regain. The consequences for China were immediate and brutal. Japanese forces knew the American bombers had been headed toward Chinese airfields. Imperial General Headquarters ordered Operation Seigo, a massive offensive to capture the airfields and prevent future raids. Between April and August 1942, Japanese forces swept through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. They executed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians suspected of aiding American flyers. Villages that sheltered downed airmen were destroyed entirely. The operation succeeded tactically, capturing the airfields, but diverted forces needed elsewhere and further strained Japan's overextended logistics. 13 of the 16 B-25 bombers reached Chinese airspace. None reached their planned airfields. Running out of fuel in darkness and bad weather, 15 crews bailed out or crash-landed. One bomber diverted to Soviet territory, where the crew was interned. Of 80 airmen, 3 died in crashes. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. 3 of the prisoners were executed. 1 died of disease in captivity. 4 survived imprisonment. The remaining 69 crew members escaped through China with help from Chinese civilians and nationalist forces. Doolittle believed his mission had failed. He had lost all 16 bombers. He faced court-martial for reckless waste of resources. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. President Roosevelt announced that the bombers had launched from Shangri-La, a fictional Himalayan paradise, maintaining operational security while delivering the propaganda victory America desperately needed. The American public, starved for good news, after months of defeat, celebrated the raid as proof that American forces could strike back. The raid's true significance emerged gradually as historians analyzed its strategic consequences. The direct damage was negligible. The cost in aircraft, aircrew, and Chinese civilian lives was substantial. But the psychological impact on Japanese strategic decision-making proved decisive. By forcing Yamamoto to accelerate the Midway operation, the Doolittle Raid contributed directly to Japan's decisive defeat there. By demonstrating American determination to carry the war to Japan regardless of cost, it shattered assumptions about American will to fight. Post-war interrogations of Japanese leaders confirmed the raid's impact. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo stated that the raid demonstrated American resolve and forced reconsideration of basic strategic assumptions. Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff acknowledged that the urgency to respond to the raid compromised preparation for Midway. Japanese civilians interviewed after the war described the raid as the moment they first doubted inevitable victory. The Doolittle Raid established principles for modern strategic operations. Psychological impact can exceed physical destruction. Demonstrating capability matters more than achieving tactical success. Forcing enemy reactions can create opportunities for decisive engagement. These lessons influenced air power doctrine throughout the war and beyond. Modern precision strike capabilities evolved from concepts the Doolittle Raiders pioneered. Long-range penetration of defended airspace, acceptance of high risk for strategic objectives, coordination between services with different cultures and capabilities, the willingness to sacrifice expensive equipment for psychological effect. In the waters off Japan, where USS Hornet launched 16 Army bombers on a mission everyone knew was one way, the crews proved that American forces would take extraordinary risks to strike back. They couldn't know that their 30-minute raid would trigger the chain of events leading to Midway. They couldn't know that Chinese civilians would pay a terrible price for sheltering them. They only knew that Japan needed to understand that Americans were only beginning to fight. The shock of that realization, more than the bombs themselves, changed the course of the Pacific War.